Welcome to the IATI Humanitarian Guidance Consultation webinar. This is the first webinar that we are running as part of this consultation, and I'll be presenting. So my name is Petya Kangalova, and I'm joined by my colleague Amy Silcock, and we'll be presenting today and consulting with you. And then we also have Mark Bruff, who is involved in working on the Grant Bargain Transparency workstream. And I think as we go through specific consultation, he will also bring some example of the work and kind of one of the prototypes that he has been working on. So we have today, the plan for today is we have an hour and a half. We'll be presenting, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion with everyone. We're recording this webinar as well. So for those who are unable to join, will be able to listen to the presentation. So what is our agenda for today? I'll start by just giving a bit of background about the IATI standard guidance consultations. Obviously, some of you would have been involved before, some of you will be new, which is great. So a bit of background on this. And then Amy will start with giving an overview about the overall feedback we received. So what the process was, some people have already shared their feedback. And then the key bit of this webinar is very much focusing on discussion for those 4 specific areas that we're focusing in this session. Looking at examples, so Mark will be showing some examples as well, and having an opportunity to get your feedback as well. And then I'll talk about next steps. So the next webinar will be running, as well as how the guidance will be updated. Great. Coming over to you, Amy, on the overall feedback first.
Great. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Petya. So thank you to all of you who have already read the our draft version of the humanitarian guidance. And thank you to, we had about 10 people who actually took the time and spent quite a fair amount of time reviewing the guidance and feeding back to us. And this is kind of, this presentation is going to focus on that first half of the guidance. And overall, we were kind of slightly, I think, blown away by the comments that actually having some form of guidance on humanitarian reporting is really helpful. What we currently have on the IATI website definitely needs to be updated. It definitely needs to be in a lot more detail. And we completely understand that we are not yet there, but hopefully we are moving in that direction. And that was definitely really appreciated by, we saw it's really appreciated by the comments that were coming in. So having particularly things that were liked were an overview of all the different elements of how they work together and how you are meant to be using them, both in terms of publishing as well as data use. We also heard that it was useful to have all the code lists in one place, and beginning to think about the alignment with the OCHA FTS. And so it's not just for publishing IATI data, but publishing for everything and how that can be used in the wider context. On to the next slide, please, Petya. There were a number of different areas for improvement, and this is definitely kind of the areas that we want to focus on. The key one that came up is the challenge of identifying partially humanitarian activities. As we'll see later in both discussions and the presentation, it's much easier to be able to define which activities are humanitarian and which ones are purely not humanitarian. But where there is this mix, and particularly within the current humanitarian development nexus, that line becomes really blurry. And this is an area that we would really like to spend our discussion time talking about and working out if there are ways in which we can find a methodology for doing this as with the current with the standard as it currently is. So we'll break out into breakout groups a little bit later to discuss that one. One of the things that came through clearly is that more examples are needed. So to help organizations to understand how that guidance fits together, if we can have some examples of those partially humanitarian activities and how they work would be really helpful for people's understanding. We, maybe not in this presentation, but certainly going forwards, want to look a bit more about the duplication of data. And this is one that comes up in IATI quite a lot, and it's kind of going, if you have your donors as well as your implementing partners, what are the expectations around what data each agency, which organization should be publishing, as well as some of the areas in which, if we've got partially humanitarian activities, we might end up duplicating data. And like, it might be that we're marking things as humanitarian in multiple different places, and is that all needed? Other kind of questions were around the categorization of organizations, whether or not, or what we're going to do looking at the humanitarian development peace building nexus, so linking in all three of those areas, as well as the definition of humanitarian. Now, those latter ones, for various reasons, we aren't going to cover in this presentation, and some of them are slightly wider questions than IATI, and some of them are constrained by what changes we can make in IATI, or what guidance we can produce without an upgrade, but we will come to them in time. So moving on to the next slide, please, Petja. So identifying humanitarian activities. This is where we'd really like to start the discussion with you guys today. This will by no means be the final discussion we have, but part of that process. So to outline, what does the standard currently say? At the moment, we have the humanitarian flag at 2 places within the standard. The first one's at the activity level, and the current definition is that it is a process flag to indicate that this activity relates entirely or partially to humanitarian aid. And we can't update that definition outside of a major upgrade, as that would begin to change the interpretation, or rather it begin to maybe perhaps limit the interpretation, and we can't do that. But it is also very unclear what this partially humanitarian relates to, how this should be understood. And this is the area that we'd really like to develop the guidance on. The other place we can add the humanitarian flag is at transaction level. Not quite sure why that was changed to organization. It should say transaction. A process flag is to, and this indicates that the transaction relates entirely or partially to humanitarian aid. And it also says if the entire activity relates to humanitarian aid, this should be reported using the IATI activity humanitarian flag rather than for each transaction. And so we're beginning to get a bit of guidance about how these flags should be used, but as we've seen from your feedback, this is not currently understood. It's not necessarily meeting all of your organizational needs. And we'll see from Mark Bruff as well, this isn't meeting the user needs either. So we are left with this conundrum that we need more guidance on. And so part of this process, there are 3 things we would like out of it. The first is to better understand the different organization, your systems, how you are defining humanitarian, what are the elements or attributes you currently have access to within your systems, and how those decisions are made. We also kind of want to look maybe forwards looking, going, if we were to come into a next major upgrade, how could we make improvements to the standard? So what this kind of future looking, what would work better going forwards? And we've also got the one going, we have the standard as it is at the moment. This is what it says in version 202 onwards of the standard. Can we create or find a methodology of guidance to make this work, both for humanitarian, partially humanitarian, and non-humanitarian activities? And that's, I think, where we're going to get some really meaty discussion, hopefully, today. Next slide, please, Petja. So, identifying the humanitarian activities. We asked you guys a question, and that was, how do you currently distinguish between development and humanitarian activities? And some of the common responses coming back were that you identified them in your data using the OECD humanitarian sector codes. And we'll look at that a little bit later. So the DAC sector codes have a certain range which they class as humanitarian, and so we can do that mapping. However, some of the UN agencies came back and said actually they've got their own mapping of the OECD sector codes to their UN internal system function of humanitarian. And so the OECD mapping becomes slightly broader for those UN agencies. So this kind of initial mapping doesn't work for everyone. We've also got some organisations who distinguish transactions as being humanitarian based on who issues the funding. So for certainly larger organisations, funding may be coming from different pots, and some of those pots are specifically for humanitarian and others are not. Therefore, it's able to distinguish based on transactions. For other organisations, this is not the case at all. They cannot break the transactions up into humanitarian and non-humanitarian. And still others of you came back and said, actually, it doesn't matter what OECD sector codes were put in. It's up to the staff members to categorise the activities. So even though some activities may have humanitarian sector codes, that may not actually, they may still not be marked as humanitarian internally by the different colleagues. And this just adds to the complexity of how we should begin to capture this in IATI data, because there is such a breadth of difference between our different organisations who are publishing. And what we found interesting was that the next question was, should the humanitarian flag at activity level refer to activities that are wholly or partially humanitarian? And it came back as a dead tie between yes, no, and unsure. So exactly a third of you who answered the questionnaire said yes, a third said no, and a third said, actually, we're really unsure. And that might be because we don't have enough expertise in this area, we're the wrong people to be asking, to the point and others saying, well, I'm not entirely sure that this is what we have in IATI at the moment is the best solution. Maybe we need to be something else. Or yes, but it still doesn't really work for us. So this is kind of the context with which we're going, or we'd like to enter into these discussions, going, it is tricky, but we would like to form a way forwards. So we're next going to go on to identifying humanitarian activities. So what kind of was your summary of your feedback? So part of the summary is that it's really hard to differentiate between humanitarian and development components. This is often hard internally, and so it also becomes hard in our IATI data. There's also the recognition that the humanitarian activity flag works fairly well for wholly humanitarian and activities which are not at all humanitarian. The issue here lies on the activities which are partially humanitarian. And kind of in this looking forwards vein, there is a suggestion to add another flag, which is a partially humanitarian flag, to be able to flag to data users that actually this is partial. You need to look at some other of the elements within the IATI activity to work out what's going on here, which is definitely an idea we can explore, but it is an idea that will take probably a major upgrade in order to implement. So given all of this context, the question that we have for you is, can we create a methodology that allows us to identify partially humanitarian activities when using version 202 data and onwards? And this is what we've begun to try and address, or to prompt conversation with, in the draft humanitarian guidance that we've put out and hopefully you've all read. And two of the ways that we are potentially thinking of this is the advice that if as an organization you can, please can you split your transactions into humanitarian and development components? And then this allows us to use the flag at transaction level. And then we can absolutely say the amount of funding that's going to a humanitarian component versus a non-humanitarian component of the activity. However, we also recognize that that is not possible for everyone. And therefore, what we could do is then begin to look at the percentage split via the DAC sector codes. So if we had some kind of marker which said, hey, this is partially humanitarian, we can then look at the humanitarian sector codes maybe at activity level, because then they have the percentage applied to them. And if we move on to the next slide, Petja, there is one bit within the guidance that we would like to flag or kind of confirm, is that I think some of our wording got a bit confused. And when we were talking about if the partially humanitarian activity has a development component as well, then this can be potentially identified by using the humanitarian flag at transaction level, as well as the OECD DAC 5-digit sector code, which will most likely be at activity level. We didn't mean to imply that the sector codes had to be at transaction level. Otherwise, we run into that issue that we can't split up transactions. So let me know if that doesn't make sense, and I will try and explain it slightly more succinctly. So yeah, what we are proposing is that we are using the humanitarian flag at transaction level and then the DAC sector code at activity level, unless as an organization you're already using transaction level kind of reporting. In terms of what you guys said in terms of the stats of who is using what, we found that kind of 5 organizations responded saying they were already using the humanitarian flag at transaction level, which isn't enough data for us to go on. It's really interesting to know, and we will probably follow up with you individually. But there's no point showing kind of a statistic of how this is currently being used, because 5 organizations is not enough to do that on.
Amy, can I jump in with a question? This is Michelle.
Please do, Michelle.
It's Michelle from IOM. So is what you're saying, if you have a mixed, an activity that has both development and humanitarian, we shouldn't be using the flag at all at the activity level? We should be bringing it to the transaction level? Or are we saying we should always be using it at the transaction level? I guess I'm a little confused when we've got this split, when we say flag in the transactions, what's development versus what's humanitarian, but what are we doing at the activity level? Are we staying humanitarian because it's partial for the moment until any sort of major upgrade happens? We say it's activity level humanitarian, and then at the transaction level, we override that with development instead of, or are we saying take everything to the transaction level and not at the activity level? I guess I just got confused.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we'd love to discuss with you, how that works. Yeah, it is currently confusing. Okay. Absolutely granted. So yeah, what we proposed in the draft guidance was that we stuck with the current definition that the activity level flag means it's wholly or partially humanitarian.
Okay.
And then to tell whether it's wholly or partially humanitarian, we could then, as you say, override that at the transaction level. Because then you can maybe see the breakdown of the transactions going, which ones are humanitarian and which ones are not humanitarian.
Okay.
The issue then comes is that if organizations can't do that, how do we begin to tell what's humanitarian and what's not humanitarian? There is the option to do that via DAC codes, but but then do we just take the OECD humanitarian DAC codes, or do we do the combined OECD plus UN mapping of humanitarian DAC codes?
Well, I think the only difference, and there's other UN folks on the call here, but I think the only difference between OECD and UN has to do with the refugee section at the very end of the DAC codes, which is the I think it's 998 or 99. It's in the 90,000 series. That's the only one where the UN classifies that as humanitarian, where OECD doesn't, because it doesn't start with a 7. But otherwise, I don't think there's any inconsistencies.
Okay, that's really good to know. What we'll do, so we'll have Mark has done quite a lot of work at kind of looking at the humanitarian data. So he will present a slide or 2 on this, and then we'll break out into the discussion groups. And what we'd love in the discussion groups is to kind of bring your thoughts, bring your comments, both about what we presented and maybe the areas that don't work for you, the areas that challenge, or if you've got other ideas of how to approach this, because we recognize it's messy. If that sounds good.
Can I raise a point on the process here?
Go for it, Pele.
This is not the first attempt to draw some humanitarian guidance. We've been in a process together with UN HRPs, with DFID, with a few other parties earlier on to also define how to use the humanitarian fields. This was also a big issue. I see that many of the participants on those calls or on those meetings are not here. So I think it's a good idea to maybe break out and draw some examples. I'm not sure if this is the most efficient process. Wouldn't it be better to form a working group, to make some proposals, founded on use cases? Mark could participate in that, but for instance, we could get some FTS people in there as well. That work out those use cases and see how to best use the IATI elements and then come forward with a proposal. I think this proposal is rather rather thin, and I'm not sure if we're in the right if we have the right group together here to make decisions on it. I'd rather have a more open process where we make a concerted effort to get the right people with a humanitarian background, but also data users in a working group to make it a good proposal. But that's a bit of a different process than right now.
Thanks, Pelle. Shall I jump in here? And I think I was going to talk through at the end, but that's a good point. So the process, maybe clarify briefly, and then we can continue. So obviously, the document was put together, pulling it from IATI standard documentation, and again, consulting specifically with OCHA FTS on that specific guidance. With the guidance, we're not making any changes. And I think we see this as the first iteration. So we have a document, we are getting feedback from people through the webinars. But I think what's coming out of those webinars is the kind of first consultation is I do think on some specific topics, there will be a need to put a proposal for that. But I think the starting point is very much to really put all the humanitarian elements. So that's why we are running those 2 webinars. Because up to this point in IATI, we've really had in different places all this documentation. And I don't see this as the end process. I see this as the starting point where I'll talk about this at the end. And I think we definitely want to involve humanitarian experts specifically about, I think the challenges, Amy just talked about the flag and the complexity of this. That is indeed the case. And I think to really set out those examples and set that in place, I think that's probably one of the things that will come up of those initial webinars. But I think the first point is very much the recognition of this challenge with the humanitarian flag, the kind of wholly and partially recognized. But this is definitely something that's going forward. We're not going to be making decisions here and finalizing before the guidance being shared. But I think we need to start from somewhere.
What I can see from the current, I did fill in the feedback sheet, and one of the problems that I have with this process is that there's it doesn't give you the freedom to really how do you say it? Point your feedback at the points where it really hurts. I think the current process is a bit too restrictive, and now we're ending up discussing the proposals that you bring forward. Whereas one of the outcomes of the group that got together earlier on was use the humanitarian flag at activity level as a default, and if you need to make changes to that default, do that on the transaction level. So then you don't need to make the humanitarian flag at the transaction level mandatory, or at least you can't make it mandatory because then you need to change the standard. But to make that a best practice, I think we're deviating here with your proposal. We're deviating here from current practices in IATI, where we have default values at activity level, and if you want to if you want to make a difference at the transaction level, you can. That's how most of the IATI standard works. So that would be a proposal. I don't see that here, and I don't think through this process we'll end up with that within half an hour. So this might just not be the right group to come up with some creative solutions. And right now it's kind of a, how do you say it? If you couldn't make it this afternoon, then you've missed the first round, and the whole IATI community, but with you missing, would be 2 steps further. And I think this is a bit too restrictive for a process that deals with the standard that's being used by thousands of users maybe. So I really have the feeling that this process is too closed and not open enough.
So my practical suggestion, thank you for this, Pele. I think my practical suggestion on this, I think that's still useful for other members who have joined here. I think we can definitely talk about next steps, and this is and having a more open discussion, which we will do as a follow-up from those webinars. But I think discussing from the initial feedback and what we currently have, I think is still a useful way to start opening the discussions. But we'll definitely, make sure that this is fed back, Pele, on the process, and making sure we have practical suggestions going forward for this specific one. I would also say that thinking about the guidance consultations that we have led up to date, obviously they were on topics where we've just compiled the guidance that was already in existence, and I think specifically looking at the humanitarian one, that's quite a meaty discussion. And that's why as a starting point, we thought we start with those two webinars and then following up with a more, kind of formalized process and suggestion for a working group, but notes taken on this. So I can hopefully summarize this as next steps as we go along.
Thank you.
So if we're happy to just, I think maybe hand over to Mark, and then of course we'll pick up on this at the very end, to just, I think, showcase, because we're talking about those options with the humanitarian flag, but I think what will be useful is to see it kind of on the user side and where the challenges are with that specific topic. Right.
Thanks, Petya. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think most people probably are aware of the COVID-19 prototype visualization that we launched back in June, I think, as the Grand Bargain Transparency Workstream. The aim of this was basically to provide a simple kind of user interface to look at both FTS and also IATI activities contributing towards the COVID-19 response. And there's about 5,000 IATI activities that are marked in some way according to the IATI COVID-19 publishing guidance. One of the requests that we got in terms of the user interface was to be able to look at the difference between humanitarian and development activities in the data. This is, I think, as Emi and Petya have mentioned already, this is a little bit challenging in the data because of the way that the flag has been originally envisaged, I think. So I basically came up with a very simple methodology to determine, what should be classified as humanitarian, development, mixed, and then unspecified. So humanitarian is if the activity is 1 and there's no transactions, or there's the activity and all of the transactions are 1. Development is if the activity and or all transactions are 0. Humanitarian development is if there's a mix of 1s and 0s between the activity and different transactions. And then unspecified is if there's no attributes provided at all. According to this methodology, about 24% of activities are classified as humanitarian, 39% are development, 37% are unspecified, and a tiny fraction, only 0.2%, are mixed. So this is where either, basically there are different transactions with a mix of 1s and 0s, or the transactions may be different from the activity. So I just wanted to show this simple table on the left-hand side. So you can see, basically, according to this methodology, the way that different organizations have used the humanitarian flag. So in the case of the African Development Bank, for example, 100% of their activities are unspecified. DG DevCo and DG ECHO have both gone for 100% development, 100% humanitarian, respectively, for, I guess, it's a determination that all of the activities of the organization are all humanitarian or development. The German Foreign Office has 43% humanitarian and 57% development. So their activities are either tagged as 1 or 0. And then the World Bank has 6% humanitarian and 94% unspecified. And so this was one question that I had kind of looking at this data, aside from obviously the challenges of, you know, how do you look at this this mix of humanitarian and development? Should humanitarian development just be folded into humanitarian? But also, if there is no attribute at all, should you understand those activities as being development, or should you just say, you know, we don't know? I hope that's clear, but this was just a very simple kind of piece of analysis I pulled out of the dashboard.
Mark, may I ask a question?
Yes, Herman.
Are you saying now that in the current practice, only a tiny fraction of the activities are mixed?
Yes, it's actually only of the 5,000 odd activities, it's only 9 that are mixed.
Okay, so are we not making too big a deal out of this mixed concept and putting a lot of time and effort in defining something very complex, which in practice is hardly being used?
Possibly, but if the humanitarian marker has been understood by some organizations as being wholly or partially, and maybe by other organizations has been understood only as wholly, then perhaps there would be usefulness to be able to disaggregate there. I mean, I don't know this. I mean, yeah, at the moment, the sort of 24% of activities that are tagged as humanitarian, or that I've, you know, through my methodology have said these are humanitarian, actually maybe these are humanitarian or mixed. So maybe is the answer, but I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah. But isn't it worthwhile to investigate that a little bit further before we put a lot of time and effort in this discussion? Going back to the major publishers who publish these data and ask them, do you mean actually not specified wholly development, or and the other question is, if you're specifying humanitarian, is it mixed, or is it in total humanitarian? Because the problem with this might fade away when in practice only a very tiny percentage of the publishers want to use the mixed methodology.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
I have this feeling that it depends which type of publisher we are relating with. So the publishers which are further down the delivery chain, they normally have much more granularity in their activities. So there the flag at activity level works for 95% of maybe 98% of the cases. So they normally rarely mix development and humanitarian. The teams know, I don't know exactly the definition, the teams know to flag or not to flag. If you go further up the development, the delivery chain, there are more like funding mechanisms that offer flexibilities. And so if the Dutch ministry publishes an activity and allows us to reallocate a portion to COVID according to some rules, they will have a mixed thing, but the granularity and the information is not at the top level donor records, is at the level of the implementing organizations.
Yeah, I agree with you. And for the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs example, I think we mark an activity as being humanitarian, or if we don't mark it, we mean it's development. And if it's marked as humanitarian, but our implementer uses it partly for development, that is the interesting data you get from IATI. We do not need to specify that. It's up to the implementer, and you have to analyze the data of the implementer. So you need to have the traceability, the chain transparency in order to make sense of the data. And I think that is enough. You don't need more.
Yeah, so I just had a quick look at the visualization, and there are 8 organizations that are publishing what I have understood to be a mix. And 7 of the 8, so one is UNICEF, and the other 7 are what you would see as more like implementing partners further down the chain.
Yeah. But I think just to add to this, I think what Mark obviously presented is, again, you have a set methodology of how you interpret. One of our attempts, and I think that's a good suggestion, or kind of following up with this consultation, is exactly this better understanding, because as Amy said, through the feedback form so far, this was also one of the questions, but I think we need this better understanding of how organizations are currently using that. So do you only use it when there are humanitarian activities? And I think this is the bit where, you know, if we are continuing with this, we do need as a community as well to have a better understanding and the differences between different publishers and how that's being used, which I think is exactly one of the topics, like looking at the guidance of additional information or additional understanding through, through the different publishers and how that's being used. I think we definitely need to hear more views on this, for sure.
Very cool. As a suggestion, these are useful conversations. If we, Petra, can you move on to the next slide, please? So what we'd like to do is to break you out into the discussion groups. So there will be about 6-7 people in each group, and please do continue on these conversations. Hey guys, I hope that was a good discussion for you all. Certainly in my room, quite fantastic looking at the different ways of doing partially and wholly humanitarian, and certainly ran out of time there. What it would be great is to have about a 60-second feedback from each group about some of the kind of highlights of what you were discussing. If I start with breakout room 1, which was Petra's group, if a volunteer would like to speak.
I can summarize briefly and then people can come in. So very useful discussion. So we had, you know, representative from the Dutch Ministry, Oxfam, ILO, and I think what people fed, which was quite useful, is that the current guidance, there is a bit of a concern of moving towards more the transaction level. So that level of using the flag at transaction level, like complicating a lot more the standard and asking questions around what is the specific use case there. There was support from the group about the use of DAC sectors and the assigned percentage split as a possible way to use that. And we've discussed a bit like which specific DAC sector codes as well. Really interesting feedback, I think, from organizations on how they have used, how internally their teams assign, you know, their different data teams assign like the flag or the decision on humanitarian. We talked about that would obviously vary from organization to organization on the internal processes that are being followed. Yeah, I think those were probably the 3 points, unless somebody wants to add on anything else that I might have missed. Yeah.
Ooh, thanks, Petra in group 1. Group 2, you were my group. Maybe Michelle or Melinda, would you be able to give a quick summary?
I was about to send Melinda a WhatsApp and say, you want to go? We didn't get that far in our group. So I'll go. We talked a little bit about the process, and just in terms, Pella was in our group and he was aware of, and had been part of the discussions before. So some of our work wasn't specifically on the flags, but just talking about the process and leveraging some previous data or guidance that was out there. And Pella, just for everyone to know, is going to make a comment and discuss that will hopefully bring back an active, more at the top of the list, a discussion that took place about a year ago, which has this guidance in it, so that we don't have to all dig and discuss to try and find what he's talking about. In general, as Ashley pointed out, as a government donor, you know, USAID would very much like to be able to see something where you can say development, humanitarian, or partial. Recognizing that at the moment, that's a major upgrade. What we talked about was really just what we thought, or at least I'm going to say on my behalf, I thought was already the standard, but maybe this is where guidance needs to be cleared, is that we put a 1 if it's humanitarian or partial, and then where it's partial, you would go and put at the transaction level. But if you don't put anything at the transaction level, it's 100%. And the challenge then becomes, do you reiterate the humanitarian at the transaction level for users who are grabbing the data to not have to go to the transaction level for some flags and the activity level for the others. So we got a little nerdy in the detail of the standard, but that was sort of where we went. We didn't talk about OECD. We ran out of time. Melinda, did I miss anything else?
Well, a little bit. We start talking about the user perspective of it, and that we're a little bit blindfolded there, or have a blind spot there. So it's difficult to know best practice from that point of view.
Yeah.
Cheers. Thank you both. Moving on to group 3, Mark's group.
Hi, I was with our group was all from USAID apart from myself. So we have a kind of particular case study, but also obviously a particular perspective. So the discussion was basically that it would be helpful to be able to say, to actually at the moment, you know, based on the way the data is basically being published, we do have a mix of wholly and partially, and it would be kind of helpful to be able to distinguish between those, because at the moment you can have a very large project that has a very tiny amount which is humanitarian, and if you want to do some kind of statistical analysis or whatever to say, you know, how much is humanitarian versus not using more current data, then you would otherwise have to look at kind of much older data from other sources. You would either massively overcount the numbers, or you would have to say it's extremely vague and we can't really say anything. And you can see this also in the COVID-19 visualization. You know, we have very large amounts of money which have been tagged, where the whole activity is being tagged as COVID-19 related. But actually you can see, if you look at some of those activities, probably it must be a very small proportion, because the activities are not really specifically COVID-19 related. So I think in terms of using the data and being able to understand, you know, humanitarian versus development, just the total numbers, having the partial flag at the activity level would be helpful. We talked about the fact that you can already say this by using a mix of transactions. And so for some organizations, and USAID is one where a lot of the data is actually at the transaction level because it's coming out of financial systems, that they can much more easily say, you know, that the actual kind of split at the transaction level. But having it at the activity level would also be helpful, because you would then at least be able to distinguish between activities where you could say, okay, 100% of this value is humanitarian versus some X percentage of this activity is humanitarian. And you would maybe then you could do some sampling or something of activities to see roughly what you think the percentage would be. You could have a better way of at least handling that data in a, you know, statistical sense, or in a kind of when you're summarizing the data, than just being able to just saying kind of we massively overcounted, or it's very vague and not being able to say anything. The CRS sectors would also work for USAID because the data is tagged at the transaction level. Yeah.
Cheers. Thanks all who fed back. Sounds like there's some great discussions. We'll certainly go over the notes and produce a write-up afterwards. In terms of timing, I think let's move on to the next section of the presentation. So back over to you, Petra.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you all found that useful. So what we've planned for the rest of this webinar, we have 20 minutes with the other 3 topics that we wanted to consult on. And I don't think the discussions are as meaty as the one we've had on the humanitarian flag. So here I'll just share some of the questions that we've asked, what feedback we've received, again, looking at a bit of the data as well. And the next one is very much looking at the DAC sector codes, which we've already picked up on. But what I wanted to present here is what we heard back from the feedback already of how are the humanitarian sector codes currently used, and maybe what the links are with the flag, which I think is quite an interesting one here. So how are currently humanitarian sector codes being used? Some of the people feeding back said mainly at activity level. Interestingly, for some organizations, they're using DAC sector codes because it's already part of their OECD DAC reporting. I think one of the feedback was also interesting on the kind of more the use side is comparing amounts with other reporting standards. So whether that's in relation to, like, you know, using sectors for analysis. But I think what's important and probably interesting to note is the what we were now discussing is, you know, sector code allocation and the kind of linking the process with the, you know, assigning the humanitarian flag. And at least from the kind of limited feedback so far was that they're separate processes. And that's where, even in previous discussions talking about learning more from organizations of how they do that. And the second question we had was, do you use the humanitarian sector codes for all activities where you've added the humanitarian flag? So trying to understand, are there any linkages? And I think for some there are, some not, or just sometimes. And an important note here that obviously, you know, within IATI, I think that's what Michelle mentioned from IOM, not all humanitarian sector codes will be marked with a humanitarian flag because they're not directly linked. So I think this part of the consultation was very much trying to understand how organizations use the sector codes. But I think the importance is, you know, if you are then a data user, how would you analyze and understand that use? And moving on, I think, Mark, to you a bit on the example, looking at the specific sectors and how that's currently being used relating to the flag.
Thanks, Petya. So yeah, of the 5,000 odd COVID-19 activities, about 1,200 use the humanitarian flags. And I think I've included here humanitarian or partially, although again, it's only 9 activities, so there's not a big difference there anyway. 997 used the humanitarian CRS codes, and 845 used both the humanitarian CRS codes and the humanitarian flags. So there's quite a lot of commonality, but of course there are some differences there in terms of which activities have used the flags versus the CRS codes. So this kind of raised a couple of questions for me. You know, should activities use CRS codes if they're already using humanitarian flags? And perhaps the other way around as well. You know, so if you have activities that have CRS codes, humanitarian CRS codes, should they also be using the humanitarian flag? Or should you be able to infer something between those two things? And secondly, if you have a humanitarian project, which is 40% education, 60% health, how should this be coded? Should you be using 50% humanitarian CRS codes and then, you know, 20 and 30% of the others, or should you be using 40 and 60% and then just using the flag? I think this is an area where I think also, you know, there's probably some guidance from the OECD DAC could help, but only in a limited way, because until recently, as I understand, the CRS didn't allow multiple sector codes, and now it does. But I would imagine that maybe there's, and it doesn't also have the humanitarian flag in the CRS, obviously. So the only way that you can say that an activity is humanitarian in the CRS is by using the CRS purpose codes. Is there a way for the IATI guidance to kind of follow the CRS, or is it necessarily different? I think this is also a question that I had.
So I think this is just showcasing again, having these sectors and the flag, like more when you try on the, you know, trying to analyze and interpret. I think that's where we're going to those conversations on the guidance. And maybe I'll stop here briefly for maybe like a few minutes if people have any specific points to this one. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Mark? Have you looked at it by publisher? Because I think each publisher has its own approach to using humanitarian flag or using humanitarian CRS codes, or so that would be an interesting view at the same data.
So you mean the number of publishers that are using each?
Yeah, for instance, in Oxfam Nova, if it's humanitarian flag, I expect humanitarian CRS codes. Yeah. Although they are selected in different data points in our system, I expect our teams to be reasonably consistent. So for us, it would always be both.
Yeah.
And then other organizations simply don't use the CRS codes, but they use the humanitarian flag. So there would be another category explaining the difference between the 1200 and the 845 or the 977. And other organizations simply have no internal mechanism to attribute the humanitarian flag, but they do have a mechanism to attribute the humanitarian CRS codes. So you would distinguish categories of publishing habits or publishing patterns per publisher.
Yeah, so that's related to even the initial feedback that we received, that some organizations said, yeah, because they are already using sector codes. But this is, again, another one where it would just be good to hear from more organizations on how they're using that. Because I think obviously on the kind of data use side or being able to analyze this, you need to have this information to be able to put those separate categories, I think. But yeah.
It's Michelle here, if I can jump in. I mean, I think the challenge with OECD, if I'm not correct, I mean, there's not that many publishers. Out of the 2,000 publishers we have in IATI, only a fraction of them are OECD reporters. So I wonder if the challenge is because we're relying on OECD codes, but unless you're an OECD reporter, or the UN, because we do map our stuff that way. I mean, the UN does it. I wonder if the challenge is because most people wouldn't care about OECD codes.
Yeah.
So I just quickly, I just did a quick check, and I'm not quite sure of the overlap yet, but there are 49 publishers that are using the humanitarian CRS codes, and there are 45 using the humanitarian flag. In the COVID-19 data.
Okay.
Can I ask a really dumb question? I guess I should have checked this before, because we're still having the cluster codes under this, right? It's not. We're not talking about. I mean, we still consider them as being OECD DAC codes, right?
They're separate. So if Melinda, you're referring to the humanitarian clusters like WASH and others, is that what you mentioned?
Yeah,
Separate, there are separate ones that actually in the next round we'll be discussing there. You can add them. So here we are just discussing the sector codes, where the clusters are kind of another level of granularity of the way organizations refer to, you know, whether that activity is linked to a specific cluster. And they're managed by OCHA, if I'm not, is a UN OCHA list, if I'm not mistaken.
We can do both, and some teams, they actually do both. They do the CRS, that's mandatory, but the UN cluster codes is now not mandatory, but possible. And the scope element is also possible, but also not mandatory. So yeah, you will see variation in our data set depending on the choice the team makes that is the data owner.
Yeah. So I think on this one, I think what's like kind of hearing from people is one is about better understanding. So it's not the use of the flag and the sector codes, but also is, again, not everyone, not all organizations will be aligning with the DAC sector codes specifically for humanitarian activities on this. I think on this one would be, I think good to have more wider consultation with organizations. If there are any burning questions, also feel free to add in the chat, and I'll move us on to the next area. So on the humanitarian scope, within the guidance that we shared, it was more of trying to understand, and that also came as one of the questions, even when we were doing the COVID guidance, from some organization asking at what level currently the standard allows this. So this is more feeding back first of what we've heard within the feedback forms, and then showing you they use. So humanitarian scope is an element in IATI, and it's only used at activity level. So we asked whether that's a challenge for organizations. Again, you know, that's how organizations are currently using it, because that's the only option in the standard, and it's not seen as a challenge. The question about whether that's whether it will be useful to be added at a transaction level, again, we added that because that came as a question from our community, especially with our COVID guidance. And I think it will be interesting to hear from the group on this one as well. I think an important point here is that at the moment, this is only possible to report scope at an activity level in the standard. So any changes cannot happen with any of the guidance, so that only can happen with an upgrade and if there is a specific user need, which is where we are trying to hear from organizations through this consultation. And I think the general note that I think we heard already from people is that there needs to be a balance between activity and transaction level data. So IATI being an activity standard, you know, we're not trying to make this change. What we want with this guidance process is to understand, is there a need there? There was a mention that, you know, from some organizations, it can be useful, you know, to be able to add the scope at a more granular level. I think an example is also mentioned about, you know, COVID being a global appeal, but some organizations then wanting to refer, for instance, for specific transactions at the country-specific appeals. And then one of the questions was related to whether this element is used for development activities. And I think mixed responses here, again, from the limited responses we've had here. I will move on to you, Mark, to kind of show briefly some of the use of this element, and then we'll be good to hear from anyone in this group.
Thanks, Petya. Yeah, so obviously for the COVID-19 visualization, we were only interested in COVID-19 activities. And there are, as I'm sure everyone's aware, there's a number of different ways that you can identify COVID-19 activities using the IATI COVID-19 publishing guidance. Here's a very simple table showing the percentage of activities and of humanitarian activities that have used these different parts of the IATI publishing guidance. And you can see that the glide code and the HRP codes in particular have been used by about 70% of all humanitarian activities. So they're very commonly used. But also kind of interestingly for this discussion, you can see that 40% of humanitarian activities have used the transaction description in some way to state that it's actually a humanitarian transaction. This is actually quite important for the purposes of, if you look at the visualization and, you know, the total numbers that come out of it, they vary massively, you know, compared with if you're looking only at the total activity amounts, or if you're looking at the amounts from COVID specific transactions. And there's a couple of very large donors that have been tagging, you know, a very large number of activities as COVID related, to such an extent that it starts to really distort the data, because in terms of the numbers, like there's sort of a very large number of billions of these activities are somehow COVID related. But if you look at some of those activities, it's clear it's probably only a very small proportion. And so this is another example, I think, where it would be helpful to have a bit more precision in order to say something a bit more specific. And yeah, I think that the fact that basically the transaction description is actually being used very heavily at the moment already anyway, suggests that it would maybe be helpful to be able to have a more structured way of saying the same thing at the transaction level.
Thanks for this, Mark. I know we have a few less people in the group, but I think on this one, what will be interesting to hear is, the guidance is, again, user at activity level, and that's how most organizations are using it. But does that meet your needs, the way you're currently reporting and the way the guidance is currently presented? People have any comments on this one?
Hey, this is Andy from USAID. I was going to jump in. I know we're one of the organizations that's really struggled with the humanitarian scope at the activity level. And right now, I believe the way our data is structured is that we're putting COVID information in the transaction description. And I think in our this month's publication, we're updating that to use a USG specific namespace. But there hasn't been a great solution for us. And one of the big concerns earlier this summer, when we first started releasing COVID information, was that we would be significantly overcounting the agency's COVID response. Because the way our activities are set up is we have large activities and they may cover multiple countries. And only one piece of an activity in one country was COVID related, but then if we had this at the activity level, it would way overcount our resources. And so Mark very graciously helped us work that out in terms of the COVID visualization. But I think just in terms of the standard itself, I think we would really like to see this, discussed and worked out a little bit more so that we're not in any case, or, whoever's using the data, there's no overcounting of resources.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah.
I would like to make a comment on this. I see the need that you have to have some more granularity in your data, because not your whole activity might be COVID related. On the other hand, we are running the risk of having all the activity level information attributes being migrated downwards to the transaction level, where a transaction in the end is just a means of communicating some financial events which happen in reality. And therefore, I'm a bit reluctant to say, okay, let's have the humanitarian scope element on the transaction level. I would rather go for the option to use the sector codes with a percentage, so that you can say, okay, this is a humanitarian activity, or a development activity, and only a small part is humanitarian related. And I know that especially for COVID, there is now a proposal put forward by the OECD DAC to have a special CRS code for COVID. So you could easily use that CRS code to specifically say, okay, 25% of my activity is COVID related, 75% is not.
So I think there are, Herman is right on kind of developments on this, but I think it's with this consultation, it's useful just to hear from different organizations. And I think we definitely need to hear from more organizations to really understand the need there. And I think from some of the groups we had, it was also hearing more on the data use side and having those cases. But that's a very useful starting point. Yeah. I'm just aware of time. So what I wanted to do next.
I have a quick question about the glide codes.
Yes.
For our my colleagues that put in the glide codes, they say that there's so seldomly actually a glide code to the crisis that that the transaction is related to. And I'm just wondering if that's the experience of other publishers.
So are you saying, Melinda, that they want to assign at the transaction level for a specific country the glide codes?
Well, right now we have it on activity level, and we're looking on ways to improve our humanitarian data. But just on so if we put that aside of where we put it, it's just, is there like I'm thinking that one of the reasons I'm looking here is like it's not that many that are actually publishing it that frequently. Well, okay, it's more frequently than description, but but I mean, is that the general experience, that there's not a glide code for every crisis?
I think most crises, Melinda, most crises do have, like like the Idai cyclone in Mozambique has a glide code. And so they, the recent UN declared disasters, they all have glide codes. Then you have local disasters that have, it all depends a little bit on the scale of the disaster, whether it's been attributed to specific glide code.
Yes, so yeah, the majority, I think briefly to say on this, they're normally, and the majority also even country specific. I think with COVID was actually quite an exception of having the global one. I think they are definitely more granular. And obviously at the moment.
Like Idai was not country specific, but was for a region. But back to the, where would you expect a reliable granularity? And I think we are trying to get it at a wrong level. If you believe in traceability and if you believe in multiple actors, like if your entities that CEDA or USAID contract are obliged or are encouraged to offer information in it, the granularity is much more appropriate at their level than at the big funding mechanisms activities. We've got a big contract with Dutch ministries called Dialogue and Dissent. It means that we try to influence policies of government and private sector and influencing and etc. At the ministry's level, the DAC code is government and civil society, the generic DAC code, which is the correct one, I think. But if you then look at all the activities that we publish that are have received funding from the minister's activity ID, the granularity starts appearing in our activities. If entities that we work with, the next in the chain, would also publish, and some do, then more granularity and more valid details, are expected there. So the story unfolds in more details when you go down the delivery chain.
Yeah.
And we are trying to fix the granularity at high level. That is very difficult.
And I think puts an enormous burden on the top level publisher to do that correctly, while it doesn't really reflect reality. The reality happens there where the work is being done, and I think you should publish what you do, and not publish what you think that others will do.
Thanks, everyone. I will move us to the next one. I think with all the topics we focused on now, there needs to be more discussion, and that's definitely the starting point. And I know we're running out of time, so I would just spend 2 more minutes to go through the next one, which will probably follow up in the next consultation webinar. I'll just recap on those as well. But just to say that the last area that there was a bit of information in the guidance was about humanitarian budgets and how they're being used. And I would say on this one, we really didn't hear much from organizations. There were limited responses. That specific, budget not provided because of a rapid onset emergency was one that it's currently only used by the Central Emergency Response Fund. So that's basically an attribute that's there in IATI. And what we do want to understand is have more examples. So it'd be really great to hear, great to hear from people on this specific one of whether there are examples of when there's a rapid onset emergency where the budgets cannot be provided and that attribute is being used. And moving on to next steps, I think what I really wanted to summarize, because I think it's been extremely useful to hear your feedback and also the feedback on process in terms of next steps for this specific consultation on the humanitarian guidance, where I think there's a lot of detail to go through. So the next step is obviously we'll have the next webinar, and it would be great to have you join as well. I'll reshare again the feedback form if people were not able to submit and would want to send their feedback. But next Wednesday we would follow the same process of looking through the other areas of consultations. And I think what's quite important to maybe follow up with everyone is what is then the next step, because obviously this is the first time we pull all the kind of humanitarian elements in one place, have this initial feedback and consultation. So for any specific questions, but I think the next steps on, sharing with more widely with the IATI community. And I think for specific topics, assessing whether there is a need for a working group, I think this is probably the right place to start. And obviously, if you have any questions at any point, you can email us directly. But next steps will be great to have you join the next webinar. And then, going forward, having a even more wider discussion with the community and assessing the needs for a working group on specific topics.
It's Michelle here. Could I chime in and just say it would be interesting if you could resend the invitation or republicize this event, simply because, not having, I don't know, I'm looking at the names. I don't think there's someone here from OCHA on the line, but as Pelle alluded to, there was a group of people that have talked about this stuff already. So, and I don't know that any of them other than he was on the line. So I'm just thinking it might be good to sort of republicize and see if we can get Stephen Flower and
I think that's an important one to maybe reiterate, because we actually, on the guidance that Pelle mentioned, I've seen that, and before even putting this draft, we had quite a few iterations with OCHA, with FDS, sharing that with Stephen Flower, who's working with FDS, and Nick, specifically to make sure before we even send it more widely that they've had a site as well of it. But a really good point. No,
and I'm sure, I can start by saying, when we talk about clusters, the biggest challenge we have is that while they have a code list of 7 or 8 clusters, often in reality, the HRPs combine 2 clusters into one, and there's no code for that. And for the ability to break down a transaction when everything is shelter and NFI, it's not shelter or NFI. So, it's really hard for us because there's not a code that looks at the concatenation of other codes. And that's going to be a real issue for us. We haven't even started it yet, but my brain already hurts. So, and that's a list maintained by OCHA. So it's that sort of stuff that I think it's important for them to hear.
I think the next one, focuses a lot more on those, the clusters. Really good point. And we'll definitely reshare the invites with everyone. But thank you so much, everyone, for your time, because I know it's quite a bit of your day, and for all the feedback. And we'll follow up directly with you. But if you have any questions or even just suggestions on any improvements also on the process, I know we've had some feedback on that, please do let us know.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.